Couldn't you afford a decent black dress? Jasmine's voice cut through the stillness of the cemetery like a blade. She stood beside my father's open grave, in a designer black silk dress, one red-painted fingernail aimed directly at the ribbons on the chest of my Marine Corps dress blues. "Relax, Sophie," she said with a sneer. "You're not in a combat zone. I know you're always desperate for attention, but this is Dad's funeral. Don't turn it into a circus." Behind her, several relatives tried and failed to hide their laughter. Their muffled giggles drifted over the grave, while I stood alone at the edge of it, dressed in the uniform they had already decided was cheap, embarrassing, and inappropriate. They had no idea what I had done only hours earlier. Before boarding the flight to Ohio, I had stood beside the caskets of 2 young Marines under my command and helped drape the stars and stripes over them. I had kept my face still while grief clawed through my chest. I had bitten the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, because their families were watching, and my Marines needed their colonel to remain standing. Now, my own family was treating me like trash at my father's burial. I said nothing. The laughter faded as wet dirt began striking the polished mahogany casket below us. Thud, thud. Heavy clumps of black mud broke apart against the lid. I watched the gravediggers work, following every movement with the automatic attention of someone trained to read a scene for danger. My jaw did not move. My shoulders stayed square. I gave Jasmine nothing. She did not even wait for the grave to be filled. She turned on one stiletto heel and walked away. The rest of the family followed her almost immediately, designer shoes crunching across the gravel in a parade of carefully performed grief. They were already heading toward the imported wine, catered food, and important guests waiting at Jasmine and Ethan's mansion. Within moments, I was the only relative left beside the 6-foot hole. I looked down at the casket, then brushed a speck of cemetery dust from the red blood stripe running along my trouser leg. The fabric was crisp. I executed a precise about-face, my heels snapping against the pavement, and walked toward the parking lot without looking back. My rental was a battered Ford SUV that smelled of stale cigarettes and a cheap pine air freshener. I reached for the rusted door handle, but a sharp vibration struck against my ribs before I could open it. My civilian phone was tucked inside my breast pocket. The glass was cracked in the upper right corner. A message from my mother glowed on the screen. "When you get to the mansion for the wake, find a quiet corner to stand in. Ethan has important partners coming over. Do not embarrass your sister." I read it twice. There was no question about my flight. No concern about whether I had slept. No mention of the man we had just buried. She did not ask whether I was all right after standing over my father's grave. Her only concern was that I might embarrass Jasmine in front of Ethan's corporate partners. "Stand in a corner. Stay out of the way. Hide the uniform." My thumb pressed against the cracked screen until the broken edge bit into my skin. I locked the phone, tossed it onto the passenger seat, climbed behind the wheel, and slammed the door. The heavy metal clunk sealed me inside. For several seconds, I rested my forehead against the hot, cracked leather of the steering wheel. I closed my eyes, and the Ohio parking lot disappeared. I was back in the Middle East 3 years earlier. The bunker air was thick with diesel fumes, stale sweat, hot dust, and cordite. Dim red tactical lights threw long shadows across the concrete walls. I sat on an ammunition crate with desert sand ground into the lines of my hands and a pen between my fingers. My father's hospital bills had become impossible for my family to pay. At least, that was what my mother and Jasmine had told me. So I signed the authorization, transferring every dollar of my hazard pay into my mother's bank account. Not part of it. Not whatever I could spare. Every cent. That same night, the incoming fire siren screamed. Mortar rounds struck the earth above us. The bunker shuddered. Concussions rattled my teeth and dropped dust into my eyes. We held the position. We stayed on task. I survived the night. The money cleared the next morning. For the next 3 years, my mother and sister accepted every transfer without once calling to ask whether I was still alive. They took money earned under mortar fire and used it to preserve the appearance of comfortable suburban success. They let people believe Jasmine and Ethan were carrying the family. They let my sacrifice disappear behind their polished walls and expensive clothes. Now they wanted the Marine who had paid those bills to stand in a corner like a stray dog. My eyes opened, The memory receded, and the weight in my chest hardened into something cold and exact. I sat upright, squared my shoulders, and reached into the concealed section of the duffel bag on the floor. I passed over the civilian phone and removed a matte black encrypted device authorized for Pentagon communications. My thumbs moved quickly across the keypad. Extract all corporate files on Ethan's law firm. Confirm current status of Department of Defense, bidding project 132. Send immediately. I transmitted the request, returned the device to the bag, and started the engine. The V8 came alive with a low, mechanical growl that shook the rusted frame. I pulled out of the cemetery, gravel spraying behind the tires. I was not going to hide in a corner. They wanted to treat me like a disposable grunt. Fine. Their civilian battlefield had just opened its front doors. The heavy oak door opened into a wave of refrigerated air. It carried the sharp mixture of expensive cologne, catered food, and floral arrangements, smothering the faint scent of incense and damp cemetery earth still clinging to my boots. Jasmine's house was enormous. The foyer rose into a vaulted ceiling, and the hardwood floors had been polished until they reflected the recessed lights like glass. White orchids filled the rooms in oversized arrangements. There were so many that the place looked less like a home in mourning and more like a luxury showroom prepared for a private sale. My relatives moved through it in tailored Italian suits and designer black dresses, holding crystal glasses of dark red wine. Ice clicked against glass. Easy laughter echoed off the walls. Soft jazz played overhead. It was not a wake. It was a networking reception wearing funeral clothes. A waiter passed me with a silver tray. His eyes dropped to my uniform, then to the red stripe along my trousers and the brass buttons on my jacket. He pulled the tray closer to his chest and stepped away as though I might contaminate the room. I continued past him and found an empty corner near the bay windows, exactly as my mother had ordered. I set my boots shoulder-width apart, clasped my hands behind my back, and settled into parade rest. Then, I scanned the room. Jasmine stood at the center of the living room, surrounded by 3 executives in gray suits. She held a silk handkerchief and occasionally touched it to the corner of one perfectly dry eye. It was incredibly hard, she was saying. The sleepless nights, sitting beside Dad's bed for weeks. I had to hire private nurses out of my own pocket just to make sure he received the best care. Ethan and I spared no expense. The executives nodded with solemn approval. I drove my fingernails into my palms. She did not mention the transfers. She did not mention 3 years of my hazard pay. She did not mention the authorization I had signed beneath red bunker lights, while rounds struck the ground above me. She had used my combat money to pay the bills, then built a public performance around her own generosity. The orchids, the wine, the immaculate house, the grieving daughter speech, all of it rested on a truth she had buried. The muscles along my neck tightened. A memory surfaced with the clarity of a command spoken directly into my ear. Brigadier General Thomas Vance had once stood beside me in the brutal heat outside Fallujah and said, "Listen to me, Lewis. In the Marine Corps, loyalty is written in blood. In the civilian world, it's written in sand. The first selfish wind blows it away." He had been right. I turned my attention toward the front door. I did not belong in this world of borrowed status, fake tears, and stolen credit. My world was built from dirt, brass casings, exact orders, and consequences that could not be hidden by good lighting. I took one slow breath. The anger cooled until it became useful. Then the crowd shifted, and an older man emerged from the hallway. His black suit was faded and poorly fitted. The shoulders sagged, and the lapels belonged to another decade. A worn silver veteran pin rested on his left side. Master Sergeant Miller. He had served with my father during the First Gulf War. He was the only person in that house who knew what fear, mud, and military discipline actually felt like. He ignored the waiters and the executives. He walked directly toward me. As he approached, his eyes narrowed. First, he studied the jacket. Then he looked at the ribbons above my left breast pocket. To everyone else in the room, they were colorful pieces of fabric. Miller knew better. His gaze moved across the Bronze Star, the combat action ribbon, the unit citations, and the rest of the record arranged on my chest. He knew how to read what those ribbons represented. Deployments, commands, lives lost, lives saved, nights when the horizon burned and morning was never guaranteed. Then he looked higher. His eyes reached the silver eagle on my collar. He stopped exactly 3 feet away. The slight bend of age disappeared from his back. His spine locked straight. His face lost color, then flushed again as recognition struck him. Colonel. For one suspended moment, the noise of the party became distant. Miller's right hand twitched at his side. His fingers flattened along the seam of his trousers. His elbow began to rise. He was about to salute. He never completed the movement. Jasmine swept into the space between us, bringing a cloud of perfume and wine. Her elbow struck Miller's upper arm as she pushed him aside without apology. "Oh, Mr. Miller, you don't need to pay attention to Sophie," she said. She stepped close enough that I could see the red lipstick stain on the rim of her glass. Her eyes traveled over my uniform with open disgust. "She has always loved playing dress-up. She makes such a scene out of those little soldier outfits. I suppose when you don't have a real corporate career or a husband to support you, you have to find some way to feel important." The words settled over us. She was standing inside a house, maintained in part by money I had earned under hostile fire, holding wine paid for by the same system she was mocking, yet she spoke as though my uniform were a costume and my career a childish escape from failure. Miller's entire face darkened. Blood climbed his neck. The veins at his temples pulsed. His hands closed into rigid fists, and the leather of his shoes creaked as he shifted forward. He drew breath to speak. I knew what was coming. He was ready to tear through her ignorance in front of every guest. He was ready to explain the eagle, the ribbons, the rank, and the authority she had insulted. I could not allow it. I did not need him to fight for me. I did not need his outrage to prove who I was, and I would not let a veteran abandon his bearing for someone who did not deserve the effort. I met his eyes. One controlled blink. The smallest shake of my head. Stand down. It was not a plea. It was an order. Miller's jaw tightened until I heard his teeth click. He swallowed the words, took one deliberate step back, and returned his hands to his sides. Jasmine noticed none of it. She interpreted his obedience as fear. She tossed her hair over one shoulder and glanced toward a group of cousins near the kitchen island. They smiled into their champagne. They thought my silence meant submission. They thought I had accepted my place. I let them. An opponent making a mistake should never be interrupted before the mistake becomes irreversible. The relatives shifted again, this time opening a path through the center of the room. Ethan walked toward us with a half-empty glass of Pinot Noir in one hand. His bespoke charcoal suit caught the light without showing a single crease. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and stopped beside Jasmine, bringing with him the smell of hair, pomade, expensive cologne, and fermented grapes. He stood too close. His manicured fingers tapped against the crystal glass as he looked down at my uniform. A small smile formed at the corner of his mouth, the kind a man wears when he believes the room already belongs to him. "So, Sophie," he said loudly enough for the executives and relatives to hear, "what do you actually do in the military on a normal day?" I remained at parade rest. He waited, enjoying the attention, then took a slow drink. "Do you drive supply trucks? Manage a warehouse? Hand out blankets and boots to the real soldiers?" Several people laughed. The sound was quiet at first, then grew as more relatives drifted closer. Within seconds, they had formed a loose semicircle around us, arms folded, heads tilted, faces bright with anticipation. They wanted entertainment. They wanted the successful corporate lawyer to reduce the disappointing military daughter to silence. Jasmine placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder. "She probably teaches recruits how to scrub toilets," she said. "Don't ask hard questions. You'll embarrass her. If she did anything important, we would have seen her on the news." Ethan laughed and adjusted his glasses again. He glanced toward his partners, collecting their amusement as though it were another professional victory. I looked past them. My mother sat on a white leather sofa near the stone fireplace with a cup of black coffee between her hands. Gold rings covered her fingers. She had heard every insult. She could see the circle tightening around me. She did not defend me. Instead, she placed the cup on the glass table and released a long, weary sigh, as though I were a child who had disappointed her one final time. "Sophie, I've told you this 100 times," she said. You should learn from your sister. Look at the life she has built." She gestured toward the vaulted ceiling, the orchids, the caterers, and the polished rooms. "At your age, you should be settling down. Find a quiet corporate job, make real money, buy nice things. That would be so much better than running around in dirt, sleeping outside, and dealing with crude, uneducated soldiers. You're throwing your life away for nothing." For nothing. 3 years earlier, I had sat in a bunker shaking under mortar impacts and signed away every dollar of my hazard pay so my father could receive proper medical care. I had made sure he could die in a clean hospital bed instead of an underfunded county ward. My mother had accepted that money. Jasmine had accepted the credit. Now my mother sat inside a mansion and called the source of it all nothing. She dismissed the Marines I had buried. She dismissed the nights without sleep, the incoming fire, the responsibility of sending people into danger and bringing as many of them home as possible. She dismissed every scar she could not see, because none of it looked impressive beside Italian suits and imported flowers. The last thread of patience broke. My heartbeat slowed. The anger did not explode. It vanished, replaced by the same cold concentration that came before authorizing fire on a hostile coordinate. Emotion burned away, leaving distance, measurement, and consequence. I raised my head and looked directly at Ethan. The compliant daughter they remembered was gone. My stare found his eyes and stayed there. I gave him the expression my Marines knew from operations, rooms, and battlefield briefings. No warmth, no uncertainty, no request for approval. It was the look of someone assessing a threat and deciding what resources would be required to neutralize it. His smile faltered. A bead of sweat appeared at his temple. His hand tightened around the stem of the glass. He did not understand the shift, but something primitive inside him did. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that the person in front of him was not trapped. I released my hands from behind my back. The brass cuff buttons touched with a soft metallic click. I let my arms fall to my sides, relaxed my shoulders, and stepped out of parade rest. I moved one step forward into Ethan's space. He had expected me to lower my eyes, apologize, and leave. That was the family pattern. I absorbed the insult. They congratulated themselves for being honest. Everyone returned to dinner. I did not move away. I studied him. Beyond the tailored suit and gold watch, he was soft and untested. His weight rested almost entirely on his right heel. His center of gravity was exposed. His jaw was loose, his posture careless. A drop of wine clung to the corner of his mouth. He was a man who paid others to maintain his house, wash his car, and remove every inconvenience from his path. He had built his confidence in conference rooms where the worst possible wound was a damaged reputation. The relatives sensed the silence and began shifting uneasily. Ethan glanced toward Jasmine, searching for reassurance. His knuckles whitened around the glass. Men who earn their living with words often cannot tolerate quiet. Silence gives them nothing to control. Finally, I spoke. "Yes," I said. The single word stopped the room. Sometimes my job is exactly that. Sometimes it is keeping the wolves far enough away that you retain the right to sit in an air-conditioned house, drink expensive wine, and judge the people protecting you. No one laughed. My mother's mouth opened. The cousins looked down at their glasses. Even the executives stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan felt the attention move against him. His ego could not accept being corrected in his own home, especially by the woman he had selected as the evening's target. Color climbed his neck. He stepped toward me and planted one hand on his hip, pushing his chest forward in an imitation of authority. Then he pointed his wineglass at my face. The liquid rolled dangerously close to the rim. "What is with that attitude, little girl?" he demanded. "You think you can walk into my house and talk down to me? You think a cheap blue suit makes you a hero?" I held his gaze. "I know how the real world works," he continued. "I deal with the Department of Defense. I sit with top brass and real decision-makers, not grunts." His laugh was louder now, but less certain. "You think those ribbons mean something outside your little military world? They don't. What are you, anyway? A low-level captain? A desk jockey major? I bet you begged for some safe office assignment so you could push papers and pretend you matter. You're a bottom feeder, living on government money." Jasmine laughed sharply and folded her arms. The cousins began smiling again. They believed the order of the family had been restored. Ethan was wealthy. Ethan was important. Ethan understood power. I was the failure in a uniform. I let him finish. Every sentence gave me more information. He had identified his firm's dependence on the Department of Defense. He had advertised his proximity to a bidding process he did not control. He had openly degraded the service members connected to the assets he wanted to manage. He thought he was humiliating me. In reality, he was documenting his own disqualification in front of witnesses. I did not answer with another argument. Words were his terrain. I chose something he could not reinterpret. I stepped fully away from the wall and came to attention. The movement was exact, drilled through years of repetition. My heels aligned, my knees locked, my spine straightened. My shoulders settled beneath the weight of the dress blue coat. The room changed with me. The brass buttons caught the recessed light. The pressed wool fell into clean lines. My regulation boots added height. And Ethan, despite the size of his ego, was not a tall man. At full attention, I looked down at him. My shadow crossed the floor and climbed the front of his immaculate suit. I did not blink. I gave him the same unemotional stare I used while reviewing hostile positions before an operation. The message required no translation. I had measured him, and I was not impressed. His smile disappeared. At that precise moment, the encrypted device in my breast pocket vibrated once. A single confirmation pulse. My intelligence officer had delivered the files on Ethan's firm and its bid for Department of Defense Project 132. The blade was raised. All that remained was to let him understand where it would fall. Colonel Sophie Lewis, I said. The words landed in the silent room. Commander of Strategic Task Force. 132. The silence afterward was absolute. The title was more than a rank and more than a command assignment. In Ethan's world, it was the name printed across the top of the $500 million defense opportunity his firm had pursued for 6 months. It was the contract he believed would secure his promotion to senior partner. It was the deal supporting every promise he had made to his colleagues, every expansion plan, every loan, and every boast about his access to military decision-makers. And I was the commander whose approval stood between his firm and that money. Near the fireplace, my mother's porcelain saucer slipped from her hand and struck the glass table with a hard clatter. Jasmine stopped smiling. I watched Ethan's body process the truth before his mind could form a response. The flush drained from his face until his skin looked nearly translucent. His lungs stalled. He opened his mouth, but only a thin, broken breath came out. His right hand began to tremble. The wineglass tilted. Several drops of Pinot Noir spilled over the rim and struck the polished toe of his shoe, spreading into dark stains that resembled fresh blood. He knew the board. He knew the players. He knew exactly what Task Force 132 meant. The man who had spent 5 minutes mocking my desk job had just discovered that my desk was the final checkpoint for the most important contract of his career. I tilted my head slightly. Are you ready to discuss my desk job now, Ethan? He stepped backward and caught his heel on the edge of the Persian rug. His knees dipped before he recovered. The reaction was small, but everyone saw it. His body folded inward. His shoulders dropped. The suit that had looked so powerful minutes earlier now seemed too large for him. Ma'am, he managed. The words scraped from his throat. I didn't know. I didn't know the commander of the task force was you. His eyes moved over the uniform again. The cheap blue suit had become a locked steel door. The ribbons he dismissed were now evidence of authority he could not charm, bill, or intimidate. Before he could say more, Uncle Robert began swiping rapidly across an iPad near the fireplace. Blue light reflected across his glasses. He stopped scrolling, stared at the screen, then looked up at me in disbelief. "Oh my God," he whispered. "The Department of Defense press release from last week. She was decorated. She's running an entire division." Relatives who had crowded close to enjoy my humiliation began stepping away from Jasmine and Ethan. One by one, they widened the space around them. Their expressions changed from amusement to alarm. They had not suddenly developed respect for service. They had recognized financial danger. In their world, status was health, and money was oxygen. Ethan had endangered both. Jasmine looked around and saw her audience retreating. The certainty left her face. She seized Ethan's sleeve with red nails, bunching the expensive wool between her fingers. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded. "So what if she's a colonel? Who cares about some press release? She's still Sophie. She's just wearing a uniform. Don't let her speak to you that way in our house." She truly did not understand. She thought rank was another social media label. She believed volume could defeat reality. In her mind, I was still the quiet younger sister at the dinner table, useful when money was needed and disposable when guests arrived. She yanked Ethan's sleeve again. He spun toward her so violently that her hand tore free. "Shut your mouth, Jasmine." His roar struck the room like a slap. She flinched and released her wineglass. It shattered across the hardwood, sending red liquid and crystal fragments over the floor. Her lower lip trembled. The silk of her dress rustled as she began to shake. She looked toward our mother for protection. Our mother stared down at the coffee cup in her hands. Jasmine looked toward the cousins. No one moved. The queen of the family had lost her throne in a single sentence, and the husband who had built it had just humiliated her before the same audience she had gathered to witness my defeat. I watched without satisfaction on my face. The truth was simpler than their performance. They did not love one another in any durable sense. They loved access, comfort, admiration, and the appearance of a perfect life. The moment those things were threatened, they turned on one another. My mother pushed herself up from the white sofa. She stumbled, caught the edge of the coffee table, then reached both hands toward me. Her fingers shook so hard that her rings clicked together. "Sophie," she whispered, "why did you never tell me? If I had known you had a position like this, if I had known you were commanding people, I would have—" "You would have what?" I did not raise my voice. "You would have let me stand closer to Dad's casket? You would have allowed your country club friends to see my uniform without being embarrassed?" She recoiled. The excuse disappeared from her face. "A family that shows love only after a member displays wealth or power is not a family," I said. "It's a commercial transaction, and your account is empty." Her knees gave way. She collapsed onto the sofa, hands falling into her lap. She stared at the floor because there was nothing left to defend. Then I turned toward Jasmine. She had backed against the oak dining table and was gripping its edge. Her breathing came in short bursts. The confidence that filled the room earlier had vanished. I walked toward her. My boots made almost no sound against the polished floor, but she watched every step as though I were approaching at the head of a firing squad. I stopped 2 feet away. The sharp scent of fear had cut through her perfume. Mascara had begun to run at the corners of her eyes. Sweat shone beneath the makeup along her forehead. "You built this house of cards on my blood," I said. "You took the hazard pay I earned while mortar rounds hit the ground around me. You took every dollar to cover Dad's hospital bills. Then you accepted the credit. You told everyone you paid for the nurses. You performed the role of the devoted daughter while hiding the person who funded it." She shook her head rapidly. "No, Sophie, please. You looked at this uniform today and felt disgusted because you thought it meant I was poor. You mocked it because you believed I had failed. You measure human worth through houses, husbands, labels, and the attention of people who would abandon you the second your status disappeared." Her grip slipped from the table. "You live for optics," I continued. "I don't." I leaned forward just enough to make her hear every word. "I make decisions where people live or die." The sentence broke whatever remained of her composure. Her knees struck the Persian rug. She folded over herself, arms wrapped around her head, and began to sob. It was not the controlled, delicate grief she had performed for the executives. It was raw and ugly. Her shoulders heaved beneath the black silk. She gasped for air and buried her face against her knees. She waited for someone to lift her. Ethan did not move. He was staring at the wine on his shoes as though it were the visible stain of his ruined future. The relatives remained against the walls. No one came. I looked down at her and felt no triumph, no pity, and no remaining anger. The emotional debt had ended. I turned away from the sofa, the rug, and the broken glass. Across the room, I found Miller standing in his faded black suit. That was when Ethan moved. He slipped on the spilled wine, caught himself, and hurried into my path. His hands came together in front of his chest, in a desperate imitation of prayer. "Colonel," he said, breathless, "please. That contract is the lifeline of my firm. We leveraged everything against winning that bid. If we lose it, I lose the company. I lose this house. You can't just—" I continued walking. He shuffled backward to avoid being struck by my shoulder or stepped on by my boots. I looked through him. A man who degraded service members for amusement, boasted about his access to defense officials, and collapsed into begging the moment pressure reached him, had no business handling military assets. The bidding process demanded judgment and trust. He had failed both. My signature would never touch his paperwork. His fate was not revenge. It was assessment. I passed him and moved toward the front door, leaving him with his hands still pressed together and nothing left to bargain with. The crowd parted as I approached the entrance. No one wanted to stand in the open space between me and the door. Relatives who had been laughing moments earlier pressed themselves against walls, furniture, and counters, avoiding my eyes as if shame might become contagious. Then Miller stepped forward. He no longer looked like the tired old man who had entered the wake in an outdated suit. The defeated curve in his shoulders was gone. Whatever pain age had placed in his joints had been pushed aside by will and memory. He walked through the center of the room without glancing at Jasmine on the floor or Ethan behind me. He ignored the broken glass, the spilled wine, and the corporate executives who now stood in embarrassed silence. He stopped exactly 3 paces in front of me. For a moment, the two of us faced each other across the polished hardwood. We belonged to different generations of war. His memories came from the Gulf. Mine carried the dust of later deployments, concrete bunkers, burning convoys, casualty reports, and the names of Marines whose families I would never forget. His suit was cheap and faded. My uniform was dark, formal, and precise, yet he was the only person in that house who understood what it cost to wear it. Miller shifted his weight. His right heel struck the floor with a hard thud. The sound cracked across the room like a rifle shot. His arm came up with the speed of old muscle memory. The movement was sharp and exact, forged on parade grounds and preserved through decades. His fingers locked straight, his thumb tucked along the edge of his hand. The tip of his middle finger stopped near his eyebrow. It was a flawless salute. He did not salute the money attached to my title. He did not salute Ethan's fear or my family's sudden interest. He saluted the service, the rank, and the years represented by the uniform. More than that, he looked directly into my eyes. "Honor to welcome you home, Colonel," he said. His voice was deep and rough, built to carry over engines and incoming fire. It filled the vaulted room and buried the sound of Jasmine's crying. I stopped, my boots planted firmly, my shoulders settled. I raised my right hand and returned the salute with the same precision. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Around us, my family remained broken in the wreckage of its own performance. Jasmine was curled on a costly rug, mourning the collapse of an image. My mother sat frozen on white leather, calculating the value of the daughter she had discarded. Ethan stood stained with wine, terrified by the consequences of his own words. They shared my blood. Miller did not. Yet he was the only one who had seen me clearly from the moment he entered the room. He had asked for no money, no access, no contract, and no favor. He had offered only respect. I lowered my hand. The tight muscles in my face finally loosened. The cold block inside my chest cracked just enough for a small smile. Miller answered with one firm nod. We both understood. I turned toward the door again. Behind me, I heard Ethan take a breath as though he intended to make one final appeal. He stopped before speaking. Perhaps he understood that another argument would only reveal more weakness. Perhaps Miller's salute had finally shown him that the authority in the room had never belonged to the man with the largest house. My mother said my name. Sophie. It came softly this time, stripped of command and irritation. I did not turn. There were years hidden inside that one word. Birthdays missed without explanation. Calls unanswered during deployment. Requests for money delivered without concern. Family photographs arranged so my absence looked intentional. And every dinner where Jasmine's achievements were celebrated, while mine were treated like a phase. I had spent too long believing that one more sacrifice might purchase the love they withheld. I paid bills. I accepted silence. I told myself they were frightened by the military, uncomfortable with war, or simply bad at expressing emotion. The wake had removed the final excuse. They did not misunderstand my life. They had chosen not to value it until power and money became visible. That realization hurt less than I expected. The deepest wound had already been inflicted over years. What remained was clarity. I reached the oak door and closed my hand around the brass handle. It was cold and solid beneath my palm. I pushed. The hinges groaned as the door swung outward. Evening air struck my face, sharp and clean after the suffocating perfume, wine, and conditioned air inside. For 1 second, the cold moved through the foyer and disturbed everything they had arranged. Orchid petals trembled. The silk of black dresses shifted. Napkins lifted from a catering table. Then I stepped over the threshold. I did not look back. The heavy door slammed behind me with enough force to shake the frame. I walked down the long driveway in a measured rhythm. Gravel crushed beneath my boots. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The mansion stood behind me, every window glowing with warm, artificial light. Through the thick glass came faint, indistinct sounds, voices rising, someone crying, someone trying to explain what could no longer be explained. I could imagine Ethan staring at the contract's collapse. I could imagine Jasmine demanding that someone restore the world she believed she deserved. I could imagine my mother reviewing every message she had sent me and searching for a line she could reinterpret as love. None of it mattered. They had become background noise. At the end of the driveway, my battered SUV waited beneath a flickering street lamp. Dust coated the doors and hood. It looked practical beside the spotless luxury cars near the house. I preferred it. The truck had no interest in appearances. It started when ordered, carried weight, and moved through bad terrain. It did not pretend to be anything else. As I reached for the handle, the secure device in my breast pocket vibrated twice. I removed it. The screen illuminated the brass buttons of my coat and displayed a message from my lead aide at the Pentagon. Defense contract files for Firm 132 are prepared. Review committee is standing by for your cancellation order tomorrow morning. I read it carefully. $500 million. For Ethan, the number represented a partnership, a company, a mansion, luxury vehicles, and the public identity he had spent years constructing. For the task force, it represented military systems, operational readiness, security obligations, and the lives of people who would depend on those systems under pressure. His behavior at the wake had not merely insulted me, it revealed contempt for the personnel his firm claimed to serve. He saw Marines as grunts, military work as low status, and procurement as a ladder for his own ambition. That was relevant. I typed 2 words. Copy that. Then I sent the reply and returned the device to my pocket. My conclusion was already clear. His firm would not receive my approval. The money would go to a bidder capable of respecting the mission, protecting the assets, and understanding that the people using the equipment were not disposable pieces beneath corporate decision-makers. I opened the driver's door. Before climbing inside, I removed my white cover with both hands. The brass emblem caught the streetlight. I placed it carefully on the passenger seat, protecting its shape. Then I sat behind the wheel and shut the door. The mansion disappeared behind metal and glass. Inside the cab, the air was cold. The worn leather seat cracked beneath my weight. The civilian phone still lay where I had thrown it after my mother's message. Its screen remained dark. I picked it up. There were already new notifications. 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 from Jasmine, 1 from Ethan. Several messages waited beneath them. I did not open any of them. I held the phone for a moment, considering the years of access they had taken for granted. They believed family entitled them to my time, money, attention, forgiveness, and silence. They believed they could insult me publicly, then reach through a screen and demand rescue when consequences arrived. I powered the phone off. The display went black. For the first time, their voices could not enter unless I chose to let them. I placed the phone face down in the center console, inserted the key into the ignition, and turned it. The V8 started immediately. Its low roar shook the loose coins near the gearshift and traveled through the steering column into my hands. The vibration felt honest. It reminded me of armored transports moving over desert ground. engines working beneath heat and dust without apology. The dashboard lights came alive in a muted red glow. My father was gone. That truth remained beneath everything else. Whatever failures existed in our family, he was still the man I had come to bury. I remembered his hands when I was young, rough from work. I remembered the rare evenings when he sat quietly at the kitchen table and asked about school. I remembered how illness reduced his body and narrowed his world. I had wanted more time. I had wanted one final honest conversation. The funeral had given me no peace. Jasmine's performance had nearly taken the day from him entirely, so I closed my eyes and allowed myself one private moment. "Rest easy, Dad," I whispered. The words were not for the family, the guests, or anyone outside the truck. They belonged only to him. Then I opened my eyes. Grief remained, but it no longer shared space with obligation to people who had used it against me. I shifted the transmission into drive. The radio switched on automatically. Static hissed through the speakers before a low, steady voice emerged from an AM station, broadcasting into the night. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Psalm 61. The broadcaster spoke slowly, leaving space around the familiar words. I tightened my hands around the steering wheel. The leather was rough beneath the calluses on my palms. In the rearview mirror, the mansion sat beneath the dark sky, large and brightly lit, every expensive window revealing a room that had never been as secure as it appeared. For years, my family had used silence as a weapon. They withheld calls, affection, and acknowledgement until I questioned whether I had earned any of them. They treated my deployments like inconveniences and my pay like a family resource. They praised Jasmine for spending money that came from me, then instructed me to remain invisible so her version of the story could survive. They believed isolation would weaken me. They forgot where I had learned to live. I had spent nights in concrete bunkers while explosions struck close enough to shake dust from the ceiling. I had crossed terrain where darkness concealed real threats, not social disapproval. I had listened to casualty reports, written letters to families, and stood beside flag-covered caskets, knowing that command meant carrying grief without allowing it to destroy the mission. My mother's coldness could hurt me. Jasmine's cruelty could anger me. Ethan's arrogance could disgust me. But none of them could frighten me with darkness. I already knew how to operate inside it. A slow smile touched the corner of my mouth. They had tried to bury me beneath their judgment at my father's grave. Instead, they had exposed themselves. Every insult, every laugh, and every lie had stripped away another layer of illusion until I could finally see the relationship exactly as it was. I did not owe them another explanation. I did not owe Ethan his contract. I did not owe Jasmine protection from the truth. I did not owe my mother continued access to the daughter she acknowledged. Only when rank and money entered the room, the transmission engaged with a solid clunk. I pressed the accelerator. The SUV rolled away from the curb, tires gripping the cold asphalt. The headlights snapped on and cut a clean path through the darkness. In the mirror, the mansion began to shrink. I passed manicured lawns, stone mailboxes, and houses designed to advertise success. The neighborhood had always impressed my mother. She viewed its gates and perfect landscaping as proof that Jasmine had won. From the driver's seat, it looked fragile. A missed payment, a failed contract, one public scandal, and the image could collapse. Their confidence depended on external approval that had to be purchased and renewed. Mine had been tested where appearances meant nothing. No tailored suit could stop incoming fire. No designer label could hold a defensive line. No expensive house could make an untrustworthy person reliable. Under pressure, character was the only currency that remained. Ethan had shown his. So had Jasmine. So had my mother. And so had Miller. The old veteran's salute stayed with me as I drove. It had lasted only seconds, but it carried more genuine recognition than years of family gatherings. He had not needed an internet search or a contract number to understand the uniform. He saw the ribbons, the eagle, and the posture, and he responded with respect before he knew what my authority might do for him. Blood had made Jasmine my sister. Shared values had made Miller my own. The people who stood beside me in the dirt, who obeyed difficult orders, who trusted me with their lives, and who carried one another when strength ran out, Those people were my family in every way that counted. I drove beyond the gates of the subdivision. The road widened, and the traffic disappeared. Trees formed dark walls on both sides. The engine settled into a powerful, steady rhythm. Tomorrow, I would return to duty. I would review the file, document every relevant concern, and make the decision. Task Force 132 required. The contract would not be treated as a tool for personal revenge. It did not need to be. Ethan's own conduct had supplied enough evidence of poor judgment, contempt for the mission, and weakness under pressure. He had wanted to know what I did at a desk. He would learn. A commander's authority was not measured by shouting. It appeared in signatures, approvals, denials, deployments, and decisions that moved resources across continents. It meant understanding that one line on a page could affect thousands of people. I had never taken that responsibility lightly. Ethan had. His career would not be destroyed because he failed to flatter me at a funeral. It would collapse because he revealed that the prestige of a defense contract mattered more to him than the service members the contract existed to support. The road curved. I pressed the accelerator farther, and the V8 answered with a deeper roar. The sound filled the cabin, drowning the imagined voices behind me. I thought about the cemetery and the wet dirt striking my father's casket. I thought about Jasmine's red fingernail aimed at my ribbons, my mother's order to stand in a corner, and Ethan asking whether I handed out blankets to grunts. Then I thought about the silver eagle on my collar. I had not worn the uniform to demand attention. I wore it because my father was being buried, because the service was part of my life, and because dress blues carried respect for the dead. Their inability to recognize that respect had never reduced its value. The uniform was not cheap. It had been paid for in years, distance, discipline, scars, and names I carried with me. No one in that house had the power to make it smaller. The radio voice continued softly beneath the engine noise. I will fear no evil. I understood the verse differently than I had as a child. Courage was not the absence of a valley. It was the knowledge that a valley could be crossed. I had crossed deserts, bunkers, casualty rooms, and the long interior distance between duty and grief. That night, I crossed one more. Blood ties had been the most confusing battlefield because I kept mistaking surrender for peace. I believed keeping quiet made me loyal. I believed paying their bills made me useful enough to love. I believed tolerating humiliation protected my father from conflict and my mother from worry. It had protected no one. It had only trained them to expect more. The chains broke the moment I stopped asking them to recognize my worth. The mansion disappeared completely from the mirror. There was only road behind me now. I lowered the window an inch. Cold air rushed into the cab and carried away the last traces of orchids, perfume, and funeral incense. It smelled of wet earth, distant rain, and asphalt. Real things. I breathed deeply. For the first time since receiving the message that my father had died, my chest expanded without resistance. I was still grieving. I was still tired. 2 Marines under my command were still gone, and my father was buried beneath fresh Ohio soil. Freedom did not erase any of that. It simply meant I would no longer carry people who had chosen to climb onto my back. I would honor the dead. I would protect the living entrusted to me. I would return to the front line, to the operations rooms, and to the Marines who knew that leadership was service rather than performance. My mother, Jasmine, and Ethan could keep the mansion, the shattered glasses, the white orchids, and the story they would invent to explain what happened. They could tell themselves I was cruel. They could call me ungrateful. They could blame the uniform, the military, the contract, or one another. Their version no longer controlled me. I was a ghost to them, and they were outside my perimeter. The road ahead remained black, but the headlights held it open. I pressed the accelerator again. The engine roared, the night divided before me, and every mile placed more distance between my life and the people who had mistaken my silence for weakness. I had survived mortar fire. I had survived command. I had survived grief. And at last I had survived my family. I drove into the night with both hands steady on the wheel, my uniform still immaculate, my father's memory beside me, and nothing left behind that I needed to reclaim. For the first time in years, I was completely, undeniably free.